afternoon. I'm James Campbell, Artistic Director of the Festival of the Sound. Like many of you, I had my radio cemented to CBC, Radio 2, right up until the network abandoned live classical music. Something that brought depth and the comfort to each broadcast was the familiar voice of Eric Friesen. If anyone can claim to be the voice of classical music in Canada, it's Eric. Imagine being able to have a conversation with just about every important and destined to be important musician in the world. But today the tables are turned. I'm thrilled to finally be able to ask Eric some questions. And you can too. Just click on the link that we're providing for you and come to our Zoom reception after this broadcast. So Eric, welcome to Sounds Easy.
It's a pleasure, Jim. It's a pleasure not to have to, organize these things and be in charge and let you be in charge. Delighted to be here.
I must tell you, I'm a bit nervous.
You and I have had wonderful conversations over the years. I'm sure it's going to just fine.
Okay. Actually, one question I think a lot of us would be asking is, how did you get into broadcasting?
Well, I was very lucky in a way, Jim. I grew up in a small town, southern Manitoba, Altona, Manitoba. It's about 100 kilometers south of Winnipeg, right on the American border, Mennonite town. In this town, when I was young, about 2,500 people, we had a radio station, a classical and religious programming AM radio station, CFAM, 1290 on your dial. And it came into my town when I was at 11 years of age. And I was 11 years old, and not only did this radio station come into town, but some really interesting broadcasters who had come from all over who were really intrigued with the idea of this radio station, which was a serious station. It also had news and information and so on. But the classical part of it was very important. So by the time I was about 13 or 14, I started hanging around. I was a radio station rat. I got coffee for the guys and I got cigarettes for those who sort of smoked secretly outside the doors of this station. And so that was part of it. So there I had a radio station right in my backyard. But also at the same time, I listened to the radio, maybe even before the radio station came in to our town. And I listened to AM stations late at night, all these wonderful clear channel stations, particularly from the US. So Minneapolis, Franklin Hobbs, WCCO, Franklin McCormick, WGN, the Meisterbrow Show in Chicago, WLS, J. Andre, East of Midnight. These wonderful voices. It was the voices. The music was kind of easy listening, schlocky, and so on. But these guys were so good. And so it was the voices that seduced me, I think, is a way of saying it, into a romance with radio. And so there I was in this small town. I had the opportunity to work, and eventually I forced them to hire me. So I started, right at the bottom and never looked back. I was 15 years old when I started on air.
One of my questions was going to be, how does one prepare? But I think sounds like that's how you prepared, just by listening to great commentators.
You do. I mean, nowadays people go to school for this. They go to, in Canada and US and all over, we have journalism schools. We have schools that teach you all the radio and TV skills. But in my day, that wasn't common. You just, found a small station somewhere in the boonies and started. And eventually, if you were any good, you went to the next station. You may have started in Dauphin, Manitoba, and go to Yorkton, Saskatchewan, and eventually to Regina, and then, to the CBC network. And that's sort of what I did. I went from Altona, Manitoba to St. Catharines, Ontario, because I was in love with the girl who would become my wife. And, and then I just kept knocking on the door of the CBC. And eventually I took my announce audition with Monty Tilden at CBC Toronto. And there was a lot of German on this test. I was very lucky because I spoke German. I grew up speaking German. And so I remember there was a long intro to Beethoven's An die ferne Geliebte. And he was really impressed with my German. So I passed. And eventually they had an opening in Ottawa CBC Ottawa in 1972. And that was my big break. I got a 15-week contract. I had my wife and 2 young kids, and we went up there, and I thought, all I need is an opportunity. All I need is a chance. If it doesn't work out, well, then I'll go and work for the family business or something. And I never looked back.
Well, you're telling the story. I bet a lot of young people who are looking out there today and looking, what are they going to do? And I suspect this banging on the door, if they know that you had to bang on the door and do that, hopefully that gives them courage and inspiration. When you mentioned that in Altona there was a radio station that played classical music, I happen to know that you were behind the creation of a radio station in Winnipeg that broadcast. I've been interviewed a couple times out there, which is an incredible. When I first went there, I was incredible. I asked, how long is the interview? And they just said, oh, until we're done. And they yeah. And tell us the story of that, because that's I think amazing.
Well, it actually links back to Altona, because after the station, eventually the station was bought by a fellow named Elmer Hildebrand, who was a sales guy for the station, and he started creating a company that had a lot of radio stations. I think it's called Golden West Radio. They now own something like 43, 44 stations in Western Canada and the 3 provinces, and extremely successful. They do hyper-local radio. And they still have some classical on CFAM in Altona, which is sort of the hub station. But a couple of years, that the classical station in Winnipeg that you're referring to, Classic 107, opened in December of 2013. About a year and a half before that, Elmer called me, and he was coming to Toronto. He wanted to have lunch. And we went to lunch at the Four Seasons Hotel in Toronto, a very fancy lunch. And he sat across the table and he said, I have this radio station in Winnipeg, this FM station, and it's not doing very well. What do you think we start a classical station? And as he tells it, I sort of leapt across the table and I said, fabulous. Of course we're going to do this. When do you want to start? How do you want? So I have to credit Elmer, who put his own money into this. And it was really a gift to Winnipeg, is how he and his wife, Hilda, saw it. They still live in Altona. They live in Winnipeg, but Elmer's very close to his roots, and he's decided to start this station. And so he invited me and basically gave me carte blanche to start it. And so we started it December 2013 in a blizzard in Winnipeg. 200 people showed up at the launch. I mean, this is Winnipeg, right? Prairie weather. Doesn't matter, you show up because that's what you do in Winnipeg. That's what you do in the prairies. You know that from being an Albertan. So that's how it started, and it continues to this day. I don't have much of a relationship with it anymore. I started it. I spent about a year and a half there, got it going, and now it's doing very well.
Well, it's a wonderful thing, and it's a serious station. It's not like these commercial like Classic FM in England and some of these other ones. It's a serious thing. It's very, very, very impressive, and so timely given what's happened to the radio and classical music.
Well, that was part of what Elmer said. He said, CBC has basically abandoned it. Why don't we do this at least in Winnipeg? And of course, at that time, people in Calgary and Toronto said, well, what about us? Why can't we do it? Well, it was a big deal to do it in Winnipeg, and it was never a moneymaker. I mean, it was, as I say, it was Elmer and his wife's gift to Winnipeg and to southern Manitoba. But it was a good thing, and it still is.
Winnipeg's a wonderful city that way. That's for sure.
Yes.
Well, I'm dying to hear some stories. I mean, you sent some video of 3 incredibly famous musicians, and I'm wondering if we can set the stage. The first time you had to interview somebody that you were in awe of. I bet we've all had an experience like that we have to go to talk to somebody, even that we're in awe of. And I'm just wondering if you have, how did you do?
Well, I'll tell you in a minute, because, no, maybe I should answer your question and then we can go to one of the first clips. Okay. But I think the very first interview that I did with someone I was in awe of it would have been in the early summer of 1973. I was a very, very green junior announcer, CBC Ottawa, which at that point, the radio was in the Chateau Laurier. But these were the glory years of the NAC and opera, when they were doing opera in the summertime. Mario Bernardi was the grand master of everything there, as you'll recall. And they were doing a production of Don Giovanni. And I was to go and interview Mario, Frederica von Stade, Johanna Meyer, and I can't remember the third soloist. I've been racking my brain, I've forgotten. But so I dragged this big Nagra tape recorder, those days, reel to reel, dragged it over to the green room at the NAC and sat down. And the women were so charming and helpful and exuberant. And Mario was grumpy. You know how Mario could be grumpy and difficult. Well, something was bugging him that day. And every time I asked a question, he would quarrel with the question. Why are you asking that question? No, your assumption of this is entirely wrong, that sort of thing. It was so difficult. The women, of course, were charming and they rescued me. I have no idea what, how, it was supposed to be for an intermission feature. In those days, CBC, of course, recorded these, all of these productions for television as well as for radio. Anyway, so there we were. And so Mario and I did not start off on the right foot. Years later, we laughed about it. He claimed he was not difficult, and we became great friends and got on really well. But he was really tough on a young green broadcaster. And at that point, I didn't really know enough to be scared of great singers. Also, in that same time, I interviewed a number. I mean, the NAC was bringing all the great soloists, to the NAC, to the orchestra, and I interviewed a lot of them. And again, I didn't know enough to really be afraid. It's like a 16-year-old, phenom violinist who doesn't know how difficult it, or clarinetist, how difficult it is to do what they do. So, but those were some of my earliest experiences in meeting some of the greats. But I wanted to play something, going back to my days in Altona. I fell in love with music because my dad, who was a businessman, but he was also a record collector, classical record collector. And my earliest oral memories, AURAL, oral memories, are of Fischer Dieskau singing German Lieder, and of the great trio Heifetz, Piatigorsky, and Rubinstein. The Heifetz, Rubinstein, Piatigorsky trio. My dad had all their records. He particularly loved Rubinstein because of his patrician way at the piano, not moving all over the piano. So I thought we'd look at some film. I don't know the exact date, but it looks like it's from the 50s. And here they are, the three of them, playing the first couple of minutes of the great Mendelssohn D minor trio. Fabulous trio. And I remember this like yesterday, hearing my dad's recording of this for RCA Victor. Of course, a beautiful LP edition. So here they are, and Gregor Piatigorsky introduces it in his wonderful way.
D minor trio of Mendelssohn.
So, there it is.
Yeah.
Such beautiful playing and these historic guys. I mean, that's how I got to love music, Jim. It was on the radio, but also with these recordings, that my dad had. We would listen to Bach cantatas. We would listen to lots of chamber music. He didn't think symphonic music was good for in the home, but we listened to chamber music, and we listened to German song, Hugo Wolf, Schubert, Schumann, all that stuff, all the greats. And so, exposure is so important to your love of music. That's where it starts. I mean, I wasn't a musician. We did, as Mennonites, we sang in choirs, and that was important. You learn to read music and singing. You learn, we sang in 4 parts. We sang Grace at dinner on Sunday evening dinner. We sang it in 4 parts. But exposure to great music is so, so, so important in learning to. I think the human species are musical, but if you're exposed to the right things, that sets you for life.
That's the challenge, isn't it? Can you remember the first time you heard live music, quality live music? Like, let's say your first concert, or can you remember that?
I can. Winnipeg Symphony, Victor Feldbril conducting, in the old Winnipeg Auditorium. It would have been when I was probably 10 or 11. I don't remember the exact date, but I remember going. We went because I don't even remember which Beethoven symphony it was, but my dad loved the Beethoven symphonies, so we went. And what I remember most of all was Victor Feldbril looked like a conductor. He had this elegant, this, you've played with him millions. He had this elegant silver hair and this great manner at the podium. And, I'd seen pictures of conductors on my dad's records, but that was thrilling. And, that first experience of hearing an orchestra live, I mean, it's like nothing. It's not like hearing it in recording or on the radio or television or now on Zoom, online. The real thing is so critical. I teach a class of first-year art students at Victoria College, University of Toronto, not music students. I do a winter term introduction to classical music. And one of the most important things I do, in addition to being as enthusiastic as I can about the music I present, is to take them to the symphony or take them to the opera. And these are the brightest of the brightest kids. Most of them have very little experience with classical music, and it blows their mind. When they hear the Rite of Spring with the Toronto Symphony in full sail, all flags flying, they can't believe it. And and then I usually get them. Loie Follis is always wonderful with me at the Toronto Symphony. She lets the kids, I'm with my students, lets them meet the soloist, the conductor, whoever, and they're just thrilled, just them, So all of these things are really, really important.
You're an enabler as well as an appreciator, and it's so important. There was a study just a while ago, probably 10 years ago, in the U.S. of classical music goers. 25,000 classical music goers were interviewed, and one of the many questions that was asked was, how did you go to your first concert, or why do you go to concerts? And I thought, well, the repertoire, the soloists. No, the answer was simply, someone invited them.
Right.
And
yep.
So I'm going to give a shout out to everybody listening here, is to say, please invite somebody to come to a concert.
Right.
Buy their ticket. Doesn't matter. You could be blowing their minds, just as Eric has been saying.
Yeah, it's so important. We used to say on radio, you build an audience one person at a time. And that's what you do with concerts. One young person. I take my grandkids, sometimes kicking and screaming, at certain points in their lives, but it matters hugely to them. It enriches them, and you plant seeds. You plant seeds. And sometimes they take, sometimes they don't. But without it, ain't gonna happen.
Well, you're from a rural area like me. I'm from rural Alberta, you're rural Manitoba. So we know about planting seeds.
Yes, we do.
planting musical seeds is the same way, and very, very important. I'm wondering, Eric, you've met so many musicians, and you must, and you say you're not a musician yourself, but you are, and I'm. Do you love musicians? Like why? I mean,
Well, that's a loaded
that might be a
question.
loaded. That might be
It
a
is.
question.
No,
And what I'm trying to get out of you is more stories. Of
okay.
some of the interviews,
Well,
and then maybe to both kinds.
yeah, well, I do love musicians. Those that love music and that have a true dedication to the craft. I've met very few on the negative side. I have met a few. I'll tell you one negative story. I'll try and do this as quickly as possible. And it involved the flutist James Galway, who I'd interviewed once very happily. Second time around, I was hosting the broadcast for the Minnesota Orchestra, Minnesota Public Radio, in years that I was down in St. Paul, Minneapolis. And he was obviously in a terrible mood when he came to be a soloist with the Minnesota Orchestra. And they had a guest conductor who had quit or who had canceled, and so they got a young kid from St. Louis, and he was very unhappy. So, at any rate, to make a long story short, I'm standing on stage with him. He was about to play the flute arrangement of the Cacciatorian Violin Concerto. Mm. And I said, my opening question, I guess it was a little provocative. I said to him, I said, Mr. What do you say to your violinist friends who say that, you've stolen our concerto from you? You've stolen it as a flutist. And he said, nobody's ever said that. That's not true. You know that. And he said, if you want to have an interview, he said, let's start over again and ask me proper positive questions. Well, the whole thing went downhill from there. I had an interview with him at intermission where he just constantly challenged me. It was so difficult. And it was just very unpleasant. The whole experience was very, very difficult. But those don't happen very often. That was a great time when I did those live broadcasts with the Minnesota Orchestra. Quickly, two more examples from that era. Edo de Waart was the conductor of the Minnesota Orchestra, Dutch conductor, and he was very supportive of doing these live broadcasts with me hosting on stage. Not all the members of the orchestra were very keen on this, but he was very supportive. But one time he was going to be conducting Carl Orff's Carmina Burana for the first time. He'd never conducted it. He was about 52 at the time. And so I went to meet with him, as we always did beforehand. And I'd say, Edo, how are we going to construct this conversation? And he said, I don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. He was very sort of brusque and dismissive, and unlike him. And so I said, well, we've got to talk about it. And he said, no, we'll just come to the day when we come Friday night, we'll do it. Okay. All right. So we came to, it was something on the first half, a double bass concerto, which Edgar Meyer came to play with the orchestra. And then on the second half was Carmina Burana. So, the orchestra's all behind us and the soloists and everybody ready to go. And so I said to Edo, how come this is the first time you've conducted it? And he said, I was Dutch and Karl Orff was associated with the Nazis during the war. And, we as the Dutch found it very difficult to live during the war and so on and so forth. So he said, I've never been very happy about this piece, but I was persuaded to do it. I paused and I said to him, but Edo, do you like this piece? He looked at me and he smiled. He was always honest. Edo was always very honest. He said, every once in a while when I'm walking through a European city, let's say Paris, he said, all of a sudden I see those golden arches and I want to go in to McDonald's and have a Big Mac. He said, Carmina Burana is the Big Mac of classical music. Now, isn't that a perfect description of Carmina Burana? And then, of course, he went and conducted a fabulous performance of it. Those great choirs in the Midwest. I've never forgotten that. One more. I'm sorry, this is too many, but one more. Paavo Berglund came to conduct the Minnesota Orchestra in Sibelius' Fifth Symphony. And he was a legend at this point. He was quite old, rumor had it that he was alcoholic and difficult and so on. But I had to go meet with him to ask if he would do an introduction with me on stage to the Sibelius Fifth Symphony. I mean, he knew Sibelius. He'd conducted this music forever. And he looked at me and he said he had very dark brown eyes. And he said, "Do people like this sort of thing? Introducing, on the stage?" And I said, we did a survey of our audience on the Friday nights when we do these live broadcasts. And 92% of the people said that they got something extra out of it. They either really loved it or at least got something out of it. And he looked at me and he said, "I'm with the 8%. But he did it. He did it. And you can imagine me, a child broadcaster, talking to a legendary Finnish conductor who knew Sibelius and who could introduce the Fifth Symphony in a way that no one else could. So those are some of the, those are the things. That's what I love about live radio. Live radio is and live performance is that, it could be fantastic, it could be terrible, it could be in between, but it's not cookie cutter. It's not putting the needle down, and that's what's
I suppose it's not really the Big Mac either, is it?
No, no, it's not.
Yeah, shall we say it could turn a Big Mac into a steak dinner?
Exactly. Now, you asked me about performers that I love performers, and mostly I've had terrific experience. I'm going to give you a couple of examples. The first one I both really admire as well as love what she does, and that's pianist Angela Hewitt, who's been a friend of mine since the early 90s, 1990s, shortly after she won the Bach competition in 1985. She's a fabulous player, of course. Most people would agree. But I also admire we're at a time when it was very difficult for women as virtuoso soloists, especially Canadians, to make a go of a good performing career. And she has. She's a very savvy businesswoman. She makes all the right decisions. She's indefatigable. She works all the time, and is dedicated, has sacrificed so much else to do this. And here she is with a great career. So I thought we should watch Angela in a very recent performance. This is an encore from a concert that she gave last fall, I think it was, with the Victoria Symphony. She played the D minor concerto of Bach with the orchestra, and then she came to play this lovely classic of hers, the Myra Hess arrangement of Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring by Bach. This was an encore performance. She's played it many times, and here she was playing it during the pandemic for everyone who was watching on stream. So there she is, Angela Hewitt, live in Victoria at the time, which was sometime, I think, November of 2020, playing that beautiful Myra Hess arrangement of Jesu Joy of Man's Desiring. Another two performers, I'm going to do two for one here, two performers that I love and have had the joy and the privilege of working with are Yo-Yo Ma and Emmanuel Axe. I've interviewed both many, many times. I did a whole series with Manny Axe on the Concerto According to Manny for CBC, 10 programs of his favorite concerti, which you can still sort of find sometimes if you really look for them. They were issued on CD afterwards. Manny is just a delight. He's a mensch, wonderful, generous, funny, giving. You know, what you see with him is what you get every single time. And the same with Yo-Yo. I have a story to tell about Yo-Yo, quite apart from his being a great cellist and a great human being, a humanitarian, someone who gives. This would have been in the early 90s, and I was living in Minnesota, and I was involved with the distribution of a whole series of radio programs in the United States, working out of Minnesota Public Radio. And we were distributing the concerts of the Baltimore Symphony Orchestra. David Zinman was the music director at the time. And Yo-Yo, I came to Baltimore. We were recording. Yo-Yo was playing the Dvorak Concerto with the Baltimore Symphony and David. And so I came to meet, interview, and so on. And the day before, it was shortly after it was the afternoon after the dress rehearsal. We all went out for dinner. So there was David Zinman, Yo-Yo Ma, myself, the producer of the Baltimore Symphony broadcasts. And David Zinman had decided we had to go to some restaurant in the country. That was where he wanted to go. So we all piled into cars, Yo-Yo, David, somebody else was in the first car. I think the fellow was running the orchestra at the time. And I was with the producer of the Baltimore Symphony broadcast, WJHU, Johns Hopkins station at the time. And so in we get in the car and off we go, and we are following David and Yo-Yo in their car. Well, eventually we lose each other, right? And so the young woman who was the producer of these broadcasts, now she's thinking, where are they? You know, we don't know where we're going. We're just supposed to follow them. We haven't been even told what the restaurant is. So I said, well, let's just keep going. Maybe we'll find them. So eventually we round a corner in rural Maryland somewhere. And there is their David and Yo-Yo's car is stopped. Yo-Yo is standing outside, taking off his jacket, and he's flagging us down. That's Yo-Yo. You know, he was concerned that they had lost us. So he got David to stop the car. He got out and flagged us. And we're just, you know, who are we? We were just ancillary to this whole thing. But that's Yo-Yo. Generous, thoughtful. What you see is what you get. There's always, and you know this, Jim, there's the spirit of collaboration in chamber music, the richness of the people that they bring all of their life experience to their playing makes such a difference in the music making.
Well,
and that,
you know, what I like to tell students when I'm working with them is if let's say they're playing in a quintet and that everybody's playing connected, that magic, the magic that happens when everyone is connected, and I said it can be then 5 times greater than any individual in the group if you're working together,
right.
That multiplied by 5. And then I say the great conductors of the world, the few great conductors of the world, have the ability to unite the energies of 90 to 100 people into one. And that's you don't get that by just turning the volume up on an amplifier and just making noise. You get that by that special magic.
Yeah.
We're heading into a time, of course, this COVID has brought the internet to prevalence, of course, and we've, of course, Chamber Chats is a wonderful series that you host every week, and of course at Festival of the Sound we're doing more and more work with the internet is becoming part of our lives, and it will remain, I think. And I just love to get your take on how you see the changing landscape. I mean, we don't actually have the national radio anymore, but we have other tools such as what we're using right now. And I'm just wondering how you see it from your point of view, let's say developing in the next 5 to 10 years. Can you see any significant changes, and for the better or for the worse?
Well, I begin as an optimist, Jim. When the glass is half full, I don't just say it's half full. I probably imagine it's 3/4 full. I'm that much of an optimist, and so I love this music, and I am optimistic. Of course, you can list all the challenges. You know, we don't live in a time like when you and I were young, when recordings, for example, were a great augmentation to the livelihood of a player. Doesn't happen anymore. It's and there was such excitement about a new LP, even a new CD, stuff that's all online, downloading things. It's not the same. I'm a person who believes that and still believes in the real thing. So there are some things that we regret that have come and gone. The distractions, no longer so much exposure to classical music in schools and so on. But at the same time, and so it's easy to be negative, it's easy to be pessimistic. And now we've had the pandemic where we haven't had live concerts. But I think in a way the pandemic has proven to us how much we are missing, how much we've taken for granted in having the richness of festivals, the richness of orchestras, the richness of opera companies, chamber presentations, and so on. And we've been able to go, in travel to these wonderful cities of the world, music capitals, and our own places from Parry Sound to New York and London. So we've taken it for granted. And I think now we are extremely desirous of going back to that. And we are being led back to that, I believe, by the next generation of performers. Of course, there are the veterans like you and many players of your generation and just below who are keeping it going by the vision of what you're doing, all the hard work that goes into raising the money and keeping a festival going, keeping a series going. And it's been really tough during the pandemic. I'm on a couple of boards and I know how difficult it is. But somehow we're managing that because we know that there's an end game, or at least a future game. And the future game is when we come out of this. I think we're going to see an explosion of music making and of concert going that we haven't seen in a long time, because no longer will we take it for granted. We know how precious it is. We know how fragile it is. So here we are, and now we've still got, you've been teaching generations of students at Indiana University. We have fabulous players coming out. And not only are they coming out to play in orchestras, not only are they coming out to teach, but they are entrepreneurial. So many of them, they've had to do so many different things. Even if they play in orchestras, they want to play chamber music. They want to start their own series. I live next to Prince Edward County on Amherst Island near Kingston. And suddenly we have festivals popping up there. And, we have, in Ontario, we have a rich foundation of festivals. And they're going to spring up again. We're keeping them going somehow through a lot of hard work, a lot of generosity by people who are supporting them still, even though all they can do is hear something online. So I'm very optimistic. And I have an example that I want to play for you of what I think is the future in a way, and the thing that really thrills me about the future. So back in, I think it was December, I met through Chamber Chats, I met virtually a young violist named Nadia Sirota, who lives in New York, sometimes in Los Angeles. She's a violist who is really committed to contemporary music. And that's another thing. Contemporary music is now really exciting, interesting to listen to. This is not music made in the university for a few people's friends and relatives. this is music now. You think of Danuk Gujaratni in Canada, whose music is fabulous, and you want to hear it, and it's exciting, and maybe sometimes it's a little new, but you hear it again and a few times, and you have great performers who really celebrate this music. Fabulous. And so back to Nadia. So when I interviewed her, I found out that she has this group called Y Music, letter Y Music. It's a group of 6 players: violin, viola, cello, trumpet, flute, oboe. And sometimes they sing too. And sometimes they pat their instruments, you know. Anyway, they play a lot of contemporary music, a lot of really challenging, some of it, but listenable and accessible in a way that's legitimate contemporary music. But they also, you know, somebody like Nadia, they collaborate. Young performers now collaborate. So Nadia collaborates with Björk in Iceland and performers like that. And I have a clip. They were invited. I don't know how this happened, but Paul Simon, the great Paul Simon, got to hear about this group, and he invited them to go on his farewell tour around the world. And Nadia Sirota's father, whom you may know, Robert Sirota, who was head of the Manhattan School of Music, and I think it was at Peabody as well as a composer, arranged some of the classic Paul Simon songs and made essentially classical music or art song arrangements of these songs. In other words, made a kind of art that bridges the popular with our music. And so this is an example of, we'll hear just a bit of this is a classic Paul Simon song, Rene and Georgette Magritte and Their Dog After the War. Don't ask me what it means, but it's a gorgeous song. And in Robert Sirota's arrangement, and with these young players that he took with him all over the world, here they are in Copenhagen, Denmark, and they are with Paul Simon, and you'll see them. Nadia Sirota is the second from the left playing the viola, and you'll hear just a little bit of what they did. It was magical, and it was art. So just a taste of what contemporary classical musicians are doing now. Nadia Sirota and her Y Music group with Paul Simon, and in a reimagining of one of his classic songs that's just gorgeous. So this is what gives me hope for the future, Jim.
Well, and me.
Yeah, you know, because these young people are reinventing our music in a way. You know, they're reinventing it, and they're reinventing it. I mean, they're doing the traditional things. Nadia Sirota plays Nick Muley viola concertos and all that stuff, you know, and she plays but you know, they're also doing these kinds of bridge things. And so it's very exciting when I see this happening. And so I'm actually looking forward to it. It's not same old, same old. We can't take it for granted, but it's going to happen again. And we'll be ready for it when it does.
Well, I can feel some of our listeners. I can hear their brains working here, and I want to thank you for these wonderful stories and for being such a fantastic guest. And I want to invite everybody to push the little button that you can find on your screen and come to a reception with Eric, and we can continue this discussion with all of you in a few minutes. So again, I want to thank you, Eric, for this, and I please everybody join us for the reception. We call it a Zoomception after this program closes, and we'll see you very shortly.
Can I bring my own drink?
You certainly can. Everybody can go get your drink and come and let's have a chat.
I will. I look forward to it. Jim, thanks for having me. You know, I'm such a huge admirer of yours, both as a player and as your own entrepreneurial guy in our classical music world. So I'm honored to be a part of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
See you soon.